Okay, so welcome to class prep number 3, and we're going to be talking about learning objectives. So it's always important to identify these, and these are basically what you're doing is saying, here's what the lesson should focus on, and here's how we're going to kind of measure the success of our lesson. So again, keeping that in mind, a learning objective is a statement of what students will be able to do when they've completed the instruction or when they've completed the lesson that you've designed. So why do we need these? Well, these are important for a myriad of different reasons. Sometimes it's how you're selecting the actual content that will focus it, and because learning objectives are basically the first thing that we do when we're designing instruction, it helps us also think of what kind of instructional strategies would go along with this, or instructional materials, or media, or resources, and then it really helps us at the end figure out how are we going to measure or assess that this lesson was actually successful. So all of those things are critically important. So here are some examples of learning objectives. And you'll notice that they all start out basically with a condition saying, what do they have to do first? So in the first example is after they complete the lesson. The second example, it's saying after receiving an instructional lecture on monologues. And then the third is after engaging in some kind of simulation with the American Revolution. So those are all kind of the conditions. The second piece is usually the behavior or the thing that you're actually going to use in order to measure whether or not your lesson was successful. So after that particular lesson, in the first example, it talks about how students are actually going to be able to create some kind of picture of a real life item with 4 different types of shapes and also to name the characteristics. The second behavior example is the students are going to be able to define the literary term dramatic monologue. And the third third example, the behavior in that is the students will be able to create a timeline of the major events. Now, the last part of any kind of learning objective is always the conditions. So an example of the conditions here would be without any mistakes. So they're able to do this without any mistakes. The next example is based on the rubric. So there would actually be a rubric there talking about what the definition should look like. And in the last example, identifying at least 50% of the required items in correct order. So, and those are called the criteria or the criterion. That's basically what learning objectives look like. And so what we just talked about is it's got those 3 different elements into it. The first part of it that you saw was the condition. So based on the lesson or based on the simulation, that was the condition. If there are conditions, there don't always have to be conditions. And then indicating the behavior next. So there should be measurable verbs. So we should never be using words like understand or know because those are difficult to measure. We can measure whether or not somebody lists something. We can measure whether or not somebody compares something. Those are very specific things that we can measure. And then the last being the criterion. What's actually going to make this acceptable performance? So they don't have any mistakes or they do a very great oral presentation. And again, it has to be a lot more specific than that usually. We're typically focused on rubrics are usually a great way to measure projects. And if it's like multiple choice tests or things like that, then that becomes a lot more narrow. So identify the 3 components in this science example. So we can give you a second to do that. So where is the condition? That's right. The condition is always going to be this first part right here. And then what about the behavior, the thing that we're actually looking for? That's right. That's this beginning part right here. So students will be able to identify states of matter and provide 2 real-world examples. And then the criteria is at the end here without mistakes. So again, it's condition, behavior, criteria. That's a great way to remember it is the CBC. Okay, so which learning objectives do you think might be better? And let's just say that all of them begin with this. After completing the lesson, the students will be able to develop an understanding of the solar system. So develop, that's not a bad word, but an understanding, that's difficult to measure. So this probably isn't a fantastic learning objective. So let's actually go here and cross that. here. We're going to cross that out. Recite a poem or excerpt of text with fluency. So this one's better. Fluency is a hard thing to measure. So how are you actually defining fluency? Does that mean without any mistakes? Does that mean without a lot of mistakes? So reciting, that's a fine verb to use, but I don't like the fluency part of it, so I'm going to X that out. Understand the historical context of World War I based on the rubric. Now, this one has the criteria, which is great. It's got the rubric, but it's got the word understand. Again, that's going to be a really difficult thing to measure, so I'm going to cross that off. And then the last one, create a Venn diagram which compare and contrast mitosis and meiosis, and with 100% accuracy. So it does have the criteria here, and it has create, which that's a great word. We can actually measure that, and it's got compare and contrast. So this one would be the one that I would say would be the best learning objective. You can still make it better. And here are some ways that you can think of making it better. So this is what's called Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy talks about the structure of learning. So very basic things like drill and practice or tests, those are at the lower level of remembering. And those are things that you recite, like maybe the multiplication tables or the dates of the Revolutionary War, or the Spanish equivalent of banana. So those are very specific things, and those are remembering. So we talk about those being on the lower level of Bloom's because as you get higher and higher, it's higher order thinking skills. And these are the things that we hopefully want our students to target, because if we just do a bunch of school that's just drill and practice and memorizing, first of all, it's incredibly boring. And second of all, that doesn't really create the kind of democratic citizens that we want in our educational society. So again, here's level 1, remembering, which is just basically recalling information. So here are some key words that you can use here in your learning objectives. And here are some question starters to kind of think about what are the things that I'd be asking my students. So what is Tinstaffel? There's no such thing as a free lunch in terms of an economic principle. Or can you name all of the presidents in order? Or can you name all of the states in alphabetical order? And so those things go along with these keywords here. Level 2 is understanding. And so that's demonstrating the understanding of different facts, concepts, or ideas. That could be using compare and contrast, illustrating something, outlining something, summarizing, classifying, those types of things. So you understand those particular facts, so you can group them together. And these are just some different question starters. So who do you think, was the better candidate in this particular political debate? Or what was the main idea of Charlotte's Web? What were some of the main things that you need to revisit? The next one is apply. And in apply, you're solving problems and applying knowledge or facts or concepts in a unique way. So you're thinking about new ideas and ways to do things. So applying different concepts, like mathematical concepts, illustrating things to show that you really fully understand items. So like here are some different question starters. So what questions would you ask of Martin Luther King Jr. if you could talk about different things that he was doing today? Or how would he approach the civil rights for today? So that's applying knowledge that you've gained from other things. The next level is analyzing. So breaking information into different types of parts and exploring those different conceptual relationships or possibilities there. And here are some key words that would go in that behavior, the verbs that would go in that behavior. So the students will be able to analyze, or the students will be able to group or sequence or simplify, or the students will be able to conclude something. So here are some different types of question starters that go along with that. So what was the problem with the Reconstruction era after the Civil War? What were the different things that were problems? Or how is the American Revolution similar to what's currently going on in Bosnia, or something along those lines, thinking about with Syria. The next level is level 5, so evaluating or justifying a position or a course of action. So here are the key words here. So again, the students will be able to rate, or the students will be able to recommend, or the students will be able to select, or the students will be able to agree. So again, this has a lot of judgment. So how are you judging a particular action or justifying your particular position or course of action? Um, so really kind of asking students for question starters like, what are the consequences of a meat tax? How would that impact farmers? Um, how would that impact parents or schools or things along those lines? Or why did the character in particular choose this approach? So all of those things are methods of evaluation. And then the highest level is the level of level 6, which is creation. And that's generating new ideas or products. And again, here are the key words that you can use. So the students will design, or the students will invent, or the students will modify or improve on something. And here are some question starters in terms of like trying to get them to this level of generating new ideas or products. Um, so could you see a potential solution to world hunger? Could you see a particular solution to the things that are going on in Syria? Or what would you cite to defend the actions of what's currently going on in Egypt? So all these things are kind of creating new ideas or products. So again, going back to review the parts of a learning objective, it usually starts off with a condition, the conditions under which the student will perform that particular task. Then it goes to behavioral verb, and that's a description of what the student will be able to do. And then finally ending on the criteria for evaluating student performance. So just to review those again, the behavior verb description is what is the student going to be able to do, and it must be described what is going to be learned in terms of performance. And it always has an action verb. Do not use the verbs know, comprehend, understand, appreciate, and learn. Here is an action verb list that you can kind of look at. And again, it groups it based on knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. This was an old version of Bloom's, but it still applies, going from the lower level thinking skills all the way up to the higher order thinking skills. And I'll include this link so that you can kind of check these out. So that's probably the most important thing that you need to learn from this particular screencast is really making sure that your verbs are descriptive. So the conditions, again, how is it going to be performed? Is it going to be by looking at a particular photo or using a timeline or using a microscope or looking at a diagram? So it could communicate the different types of situations that the students will be in as you're measuring their learning, the tools that they may have, the references or aids that are going to be provided for that particular student. And then finally, the criteria. So how well must this be performed in order for you to think that the student has met the learning objective? And again, it should be measurable, and you should include the criteria for evaluating that particular performance. Here's just kind of how the parts interact, and this is basically a template that I usually use for my, when I'm writing a standard. So I always say based on, insert the conditions here, the student will be able to, and that's just an abbreviation I use so that I can save some space. The student will be able to insert the behavior here using this particular criteria. So here's an example of the learning objective. So the student will create a timeline of the main events at Gettysburg so that is right here. This is the behavior. Then we have the conditions right here. And this is the criterion. Okay, so aligning learning objectives to standards. Here's another example of that same learning objective, and here were the standards that we took out. So identifying major events. So Gettysburg would be a major event that happened, and then using a timeline. So after they're doing their graphic organizer, they will create a timeline. So both of those standards are being addressed by this particular learning objective. And remember that a well-written learning objective always provides a clear picture, and the biggest key point should be that they are observable or measurable. Good luck with writing your learning objectives, and make sure that you answer the questions for Class Prep 2 based on this video.